StudyJesus.com presents Bible Stories, where biblical stories of the ages come alive.
In our last story, Jesus and his disciples were in the garden called Gethsemane. Jesus had been praying to his Father in heaven, and not long after returning for the third time to his sleeping disciples, Peter, James, and John, Jesus said to them, "Rise now, and let us be going, for he that will betray me is nearby." The disciples were on their feet before Jesus finished speaking, and at the same moment they saw Judas coming toward them, and coming with him was a crowd of men carrying torches and armed with swords and sticks. Continuing with our series on the life of Christ, this story from the Bible is titled Friday.
Precious memories.
StudyJesus.com presents Bible Stories with your host, Dr. Joe Jackson. Stories directly from God's holy word, told in easy-to-understand story form that the whole family will enjoy, and featuring the work of a talented artist illustrating each week's story. Now gather the family, because it's time for this week's Bible Story.
Judas had been busy since he had left his friends in the upper room, and he must have seen Jesus and the disciples leave the house, and he'd followed them until he was sure where they were going. He knew the garden well, for he had often been there with Jesus and the other disciples. As soon as Judas was sure that Jesus and his disciples were going to the Garden of Gethsemane, he rushed to tell the priests and the Pharisees that now was the time to seize Jesus, for there was no one with him but just a few of his disciples. So the rulers of the children of Israel quickly gathered together a band of men, armed them with swords and sticks, and put Judas at the head of this group. And then Judas led the armed men to the place where he had so often sat and listened to the words of Jesus. Judas had given the armed men this sign: "The man whom I kiss is the one you want. Hold him fast." As this group of men drew near Jesus, no comma there, right. As this group of men drew near, Jesus walked toward them, and Judas kissed Jesus, saying, "Hail, Master." Jesus didn't push him away, and he didn't even speak unkindly to Judas. But looking with eyes full of sorrow and pity at the man he had chosen for a friend, he said, "Judas, do you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" The disciples, who were now wide awake, saw that Jesus was in danger. They had two swords among them, and Peter said, "Lord, shall we strike them with our swords?" And without waiting for an answer, he struck a servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Jesus said, "Put up your sword, Peter. Do you not know that I can even now pray to my Father, and he would give me a great army of angels? But I must finish my work. I must die to save the world." And Jesus then touched the ear of the man and healed it. And then turning to the armed men, Jesus asked, "Whom do you seek?" They answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus responded, "I'm he." The men were so astonished to have Jesus give himself up without even trying to defend himself or let his disciples defend him, that they fell backward. And again Jesus asked, "Whom do you seek?" And again they answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus then said, "I've told you already that I am he. If therefore you seek me, let these, my friends, go. Why did you come out as against a thief with swords and clubs? I sat with you every day in the temple, and you didn't lay a hand on me." They now took hold of Jesus, and they bound him and led him away. And though all the disciples had boasted that they would never leave Jesus, every one of them ran off and left him alone with these cruel men. They took Jesus first to the house of Annas, the high priest, and then to Caiaphas, Annas' son-in-law, who was the one who really did the work of the high priest at this particular time. Caiaphas was the man who had said that it was better that Jesus should die, and he was one of those who had tried the hardest to stop Jesus' teaching. Peter and John, by this time, had come back to see what was being done with Jesus. John, who was known at the palace of the high priest, was allowed to go inside, but Peter couldn't go any farther than the outside door, actually. John went out and spoke to the woman who had charge of the door and asked her to let Peter come in also. As she showed Peter in, the woman asked, "Are you not one of the man's disciples?" And Peter said, "No, I'm not." And then Peter went in and stood at the fire with some of the servants to warm himself because it was cold. At this time, Jesus was standing before Caiaphas, who was asking him questions about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus said, "I have taught where everyone who wished to do so could hear me. I've said nothing in secret, but have taught in the synagogue and I've taught in the temple where all the Jews come together. Why do you ask me what I've taught? Ask those who heard me what I've said to them." And when Jesus had spoken these words, one of the officers who stood by struck him with the palm of his hand and said, "Why do you answer the high priest like this?" Jesus said, "Did I say anything wrong? If I did, tell us what it was. But if I didn't, why did you strike me?" The chief priests tried hard to find someone who could tell of some law which Jesus had broken or something wrong that he'd tried to teach. But they couldn't do it until at last they found 2 or 3 people who were willing to tell lies about Jesus. But the stories of these men didn't agree, so there was really nothing to prove Jesus guilty. Caiaphas stood up and, looking at Jesus, asked, "Have you nothing to say about these stories which they're telling of you?" Jesus didn't answer. The high priest then said, "Answer me. Are you the Christ, the Son of God?" And Jesus said, "I am." Upon hearing these words, Caiaphas said to the rest of the council, "We don't need to hear anything more, for we ourselves have heard what the man has just said. What do you think of him?" And they all shouted, "He is guilty and must be put to death." Now all of this happened early Friday morning before the sun was up, although by law the Sanhedrin couldn't try a prisoner until after sunrise. So they had to wait till that time before an official vote could be taken. Jesus was put into charge of some officers who treated him badly, so badly that we just can hardly bear to think about it. They blindfolded Jesus and then struck him, and then they asked mockingly, "Tell us who struck you." They spit in his face and they said everything they could think of to make fun of him and hurt his feelings. As soon as the sun was up, which was about 6 o'clock, the officers led their prisoner, Jesus, into the regular courtroom. To get to the courtroom, they had to lead him through the porch where Simon Peter was standing there with some of the servants. When we last saw Peter, remember, he was warming himself at the fire. But after he had gotten warm, he'd gone out into the porch to wait till the trial was over. He'd been there only a short time when a girl said to the others, "This fellow's one of the men who was with Jesus of Nazareth." Peter, who knew that those who were around him were unfriendly to Jesus, was afraid to say that he was a disciple of Jesus. So he said, "I don't know the man." About an hour later, a man who had been watching Peter carefully said, "This fellow here must have been with Jesus, for I saw him at the garden with him. And you can tell by the way he talks that he came from Galilee." Again, Peter said, "I don't know this man. I don't even know him of whom you speak." And just then the cock crowed. And Peter, who but a few hours before had boasted that he would go to prison with Jesus or even die for him, remembered what Jesus had said when Peter had made that boast. Jesus had said to Peter, "I tell you that before the cock crows, you will have denied me 3 times. Now, just at the moment when Peter said, "I don't know the man," Jesus, who was being led to the courtroom by the officers, passed through the porch and heard what Peter, his friend and disciple, said. As Peter raised his eyes, Jesus turned and looked at him. It was the same loving face that had looked at Peter so many times for the last 3 years, but now with such a sad and grieved look that it almost broke Peter's heart. He never forgot that look. It was too late now to be sorry, but Peter went out and wept bitter tears. The court was now ready to quickly take the official vote. The question was asked of Jesus, "Are you the Christ? Tell us." Jesus answered, "If I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I ask you, you won't answer me or let me go. The time is coming when the Son of Man will sit on the right hand of God." And then they all said, "Are you the Son of God?" And Jesus told them that he was, and that at the end of the world they would see him with the angels coming in power to be the judge. They said, "That's enough. He has spoken blasphemy. We do not need to hear anything more." The vote was then taken, and it was decided that Jesus should die. Lord willing, next time we'll find out more about how they plan to carry out their vote to kill Jesus. And we'll conclude this story titled Friday.
Precious memories, unseen angels, sent from somewhere to my soul.